Hello and welcome to Oh God What Now, your gin and tonic in troubled times. I'm Seth Thévoz. Who is Chris Bryant? Is he a pillar of the establishment, an MP for a quarter of a century with a knighthood? Or is he a radical who has broken barriers for much of his life? The first former Anglican priest to sit as an MP for 200 years, and a pioneer for gay rights who held the first ever civil partnership to be celebrated in the House of Commons in 2010. He also wrote James and John, a true story of prejudice and murder, which sheds light on the persecution of gay men. He had the dubious honour of chairing Parliament's Standards and Privileges Committee during the scandal glory years, if there is such a thing, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, and he's now Minister of State for both data protection and telecoms and creative industries, arts and tourism. And he joins us in the studio now, having just published his memoir, A Life and a Half, The Unexpected Making of a Politician. Hello, Chris.
Hello. Well, nice to see you. I think I'm none of the above, or all of the above, all in one. I remember when I was a vicar. I wasn't really a vicar, if we're going to be precise. I was a curate, but a priest in the Church of England nonetheless. I was preparing kids for confirmation, and I asked one of the kids whether she was good or bad, and she said, well, I'm a bit streaky. So I think that's about it, really. I'm a bit streaky.
That's not a bad summary. I mean, in the acknowledgements of the book, you also have a little summary where you thank the bishops, drag queens, MPs, actors and lovers, as well as all the people you've irritated. Is that the secret to your success?
There's quite a lot of people I've irritated, I think. Who knows, I might have irritated a couple more by the end of this. I think, yes, I mean, it's been quite colourful. There's quite a lot of shenanigans in the book. And I've tried to make it as profoundly honest as I can. One of the things I say in the introduction is I tried not to make it a biography of Chris Bryant by Chris Bryant, because that would be a rather dull thing. So it is more of a self-exploration in a sense. And it was very weird when I was reading the audiobook, because I'd finished writing the book before the general election. I did the audiobook a few weeks ago after we'd finished with all the revisions and stuff. And something struck me really clearly. So one was that whenever I talk about somebody that I admire, I refer to them as clever. I obviously think cleverness is a really important thing. And secondly, the emotions that come through a lot from me are anger and guilt / shame. And I think that's a lot to do with my mother's alcoholism and that stuff.
Yes, and I think we'll be exploring that a bit more later on. Also with us today is columnist for The Observer and The New World and Dorothy Parker of the Internet, Marie Leconte. Hello.
Hello. I like this.
Dorothy Parker of the Internet. What does that mean?
She dispenses quips.
I'll take it.
Marie, you talked on Friday's show about the protests around asylum seeker hotels and how politicians like Robert Jenrick seem desperate for them to get worse. After a court ruling, Labour are now drawing up plans to move asylum seekers out of the hotel in Epping. But they've been very quiet on this topic. Are they going to have to break that silence, or have the agenda set for them by Farage, Jenrick and the far right?
I really enjoy how unleading this question is. It's nearly tempting to be like, no, actually, I think they should just, get Farage to lead the agenda. That's fine. I think that the problem seems to be that I think the government, not unreasonably for a while, was a bit like, actually, we're going to try and solve immigration in general as a kind of wider thing. So in terms of the visas, what we're getting, what we're not getting, etc., kind of solving the bigger picture and, kind of assuming that as a result, people would stop caring about small boats as much because they presumably assumed that small boats were kind of nearly a symptom of the wider problem. That doesn't really seem to be working. I think, really it is actively sort of, small boats, but also I think, again, it's now, the hotels in which asylum seekers are being kept in. So you do have these kind of very totemic kind of small issues where, you can't really avoid them, I think. And I'm not... So obviously I do think that they should actually be saying more. And also they probably should take a leaf out of Tony Blair's book. I think Tony Blair was actually historically quite good at defending immigration, kind of making a positive case for it back when he was Prime Minister.
Chris Bryant, your book is quite an epic. It covers growing up in General Franco's Spain, an unhappy home life at times, including caring for your brother and your mother as she struggled with alcoholism, some harrowing sexual abuse by the former head of the National Youth Theatre, and then some relentless scrutiny when you ran for Parliament in South Wales as an out gay man and a former priest. Do you ever think you'd run out of material?
No, there's plenty of material. There's a lot of very funny stories, I suppose. And you're not the first person to use the word harrowing in relation to some of the stories about Mum. And that's because it was a really tough time. I remember I had terrible eczema all across my forehead for most of my teenage years. I used to wear my hair quite long just to cover it. There'll be thousands of people in the country who've had alcoholic parents, and it's a really tough experience because you come home, Mum, have you been drinking? No. What's that? It's water. Mum, it's clearly vodka. It's obviously vodka, and you're absolutely hammered. No, I'm not. And anyway, what right have you to tell me how to live my life and all of that? And this used to go on and on and on. And then when Dad left home, I was effectively running the household. I mean, it meant I learned how to cook and iron and wash and all that kind of stuff. And made me the kind of person who, A, hated feeling powerless. And I think that's where a lot of my politics stem from, really. And secondly, somebody who wanted to fix things. I wanted to fix everything. And you just can't sometimes. And then that leaves you with a sense of fury.
And so what's interesting, and I guess slightly shocking, is that so obviously after this you went to university and you got involved in politics sort of quite early on, but actually as a Conservative originally. So what kind of young Tory were you at the time?
Well, William Hague maintains, though this is a fib, that I wore a cravat throughout my time at Oxford. I admit that I owned a cravat, and it was very stylish. I might have, in fact, have owned two, but I think I wore it very often, but I was a proper little Tory. When I was at Cheltenham College, I'd been at prep school and then, a public school, and I arrived at Oxford as a proper little Tory. And it was partly my experience in the church that sort of transformed my politics, and then part of my training for the priesthood I did in Latin America, and that where I experienced Pinochet's violence against the people of Chile. Ended up coming back with some tear gas canisters that had been made in the UK but were being used by Chilean police, and that's what led to me joining the Labour Party way back in 1986.
And so did you remain friends with kind of any of the Conservatives you campaigned with at Oxford or kind of socialised with? Are these people who are still your people?
Mel Stride was at Oxford with me, and Richard Fuller. And in fact, I think when I was standing for Speaker, however many years ago it was, I remember going to speak to the 1922 committee, and lots of Tories in there. And I said, well, the last time I came to talk to a bunch of Tories, Richard Fuller and Mel Stride were in the room, and lo and behold, they're still here. So I've changed, but they haven't, to quote Zelensky.
And so obviously you mentioned in the book that you partially grew up in Franco Spain. How did you come to be there, and what were your parents doing?
So I always used to believe that Mum and Dad met because Dad was driving Shirley Bassey to London for her first performance on the 6-5 special, and Mum looked after her makeup. This, unfortunately, it proves is not true. However, Mum did look after Shirley Bassey's wigs, which may explain my sexuality. Who knows? That's a joke. I don't think that's how it works. But the Dad, when he left school, went to work in a hotel on the Costa Brava in Franco, Spain. Dad was rather liked Franco's version of politics, I think, which may explain some of why I ended up being a young Tory, as it were, when I arrived at Oxford. And Mum was on holiday. She was a makeup artist at the BBC. That's how they met. And so Dad then got an apprenticeship with IBM, and he became a computer person who spoke Spanish. So our life was made. We went to live in Bilbao and then in Madrid. And I remember in Bilbao, about a week after we'd arrived, I was playing in the street. I think I had a stick and playing in the sand, and some kids, Spanish kids, found me, and they started shouting "pelirrojo" at me, which means ginger in Spanish, and I didn't speak any Spanish. So then they tied me to a tree and started flicking pine cones at me, and that's when I learnt Spanish rather quickly. Which is why one of my favourite words is ojalá, which is a kind of Arabic word, which in Spanish means if only, or would that, or I wish. And there's a great song by Silvia Rodriguez all about ojalá, which is both political and personal. And I suppose that's what my whole, I feel my whole life is about, is if only, I wish, and sometimes trying to make those things into reality.
No, that makes sense. And so, you still speak fluent Spanish, I believe.
Sí, hablo castellano.
I technically speak Spanish, but I'm incredibly rusty, so I will not reply. But I did understand that. Let the record state. Got that. But so obviously, both Seth and I speak several languages, and I think that's something that matters, I would say, to the both of us. And what has speaking several languages done to you or to your life? How has it changed things? And I guess separately as well, kind of getting back to politics, how do you feel about the fact that I guess that fewer and fewer kids these days are kind of learning languages and actually becoming properly fluent in them?
I think learning another language is really, really important because it means that, apart from anything else, you get to see the world from a slightly different perspective. I mean, it's also landed me some great jobs. For 2 years, I was head of European affairs for the BBC. And I remember at the time, Rupert Murdoch was challenging, ironically enough, was challenging the existence of the BBC licence fee as illegal state aid under EU law. And so I took Greg Dyke on the first day that he was Director General of the BBC to Brussels to try and persuade the Commission that they should chuck Rupert Murdoch's complaint out. And we sat around this table with Romano Prodi, the President of the Commission, who was a large chap, and there were 4 white leather armchairs around a small table, and we laid out our case. And then he said, "You talk to me of media tycoons." And he leant forward, and so we leant forward. He said, "I say to you one word only." And he fell fast asleep. So we're all leaning forward round this table, and the President of the Commission is fast asleep. And Greg Dyke looks to me. I go, "I don't know what am I?" So I prodded Prodi, sort of on the nose, actually. And then he goes, "Berlusconi." So it's been very useful being able to speak 4 languages. And indeed, I managed to put into Greg Dyke's mouth a joke, a bilingual joke, which he said nobody will understand it. So we're in Brussels and he's making a speech, and we're just next to the European Parliament building, which, as you know, looks a bit like a railway station. And I got him to say, "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la gare." It's magnificent, but it's not the railway station. Obviously, the joke about "C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la gare." And everybody laughed. He got a standing ovation at the end, and he had no idea why.
On what other podcast do you get a government minister doing an impression of Romano Prodi?
Yes. I mean, and also for that matter, I mean, I travelled in Russia when it was still, in 1987, when it was still obviously communist. We went to Leningrad. I've never been to St. Petersburg. I've only been to Leningrad. And we had an amazing guide called Galina, who would say, "Here on left, very fine example of late Stalinist ugly architecture, followed by another example, late Stalin. In fact, whole road of late Stalinist ugly architecture." And one day we were there there were 52 of us on the bus, us two, me and another priest in the Church of England, and 50 young girls, all from California, from Fresno in California. And one of them came up to us at the railway station and said to Galina, "Excuse me, is this where Anna Karenina threw herself underneath the train?" Galina goes, "No, absolutely not." She comes back, "You sure this isn't where Anna Karenina threw herself underneath the train?" "No, Anna Karenina fictional character never exist." And the girl comes back and she says, "Excuse me, are we allowed to smoke on the train?" "Absolutely not. It is forbidden on Soviet trains to eat, smoke, drink, or make whoopee." That was not in Russian, obviously. Sorry, you weren't expecting.
No, it's more like good luck with that segue, Seth. I think it's
sorry,
back somehow
but I
to
mean,
the interview.
these are some of the stories that are in my book. I've been very fortunate to have quite an extraordinary life before I got into politics. And the weird thing, or maybe the weird thing, people have described this as a political memoir, and in a way, it's not at all, because it stops on the day that I get elected as MP for the Ronda in 2001. So it's not about partisan. It's not me settling scores with other politicians. It's none of that. It's my life story before I got to Parliament.
But all politics is deeply personal, and it very much does cover the personal things that made you.
Yes, I make that point, actually, because when I was Frank Dobson's election agent, I'd gone to an event at Camden Town Hall, and I couldn't understand why a particular member of the party who was on the hard right of the Labour Party back then had voted for somebody who was on the hard left within the group. And Frank said, "There used to be an item, never underestimate the personal in politics."
You've talked a bit about your father already, and you write in the book about how he was a distant man who divorced your mother, and he was absent for a long time. You had no contact for years. How do you think that shaped you?
Well, in fact, part of my training to be a priest, I did a counselling course at the Westminster Pastoral Foundation, and it was every Thursday afternoon. And so the first half would be taught classes of 16 of us, and then the second half would be an hour with a facilitator, just 8 of us. And I remember the facilitator didn't say anything for 2 years until one afternoon there was no conversation left in the group. And suddenly she said, "Is it all about fathers?" Which set off a whole conversation. And I think a lot of the things that affect how I view the world are about my relationship with my father. He was very angry with me. He thought that I took Mum's side when they divorced. I mean, I didn't have any choice. She was a complete mess. I took her through DTs. I took her through withdrawal. I went to the doctor for her. That didn't always go out well. I persuaded her to have a liver function test, and it came back perfect. And she said, "See, I'm not drinking enough, Christopher." So that was a difficult relationship. But in the end, I wrote to the dad and said, "Look, you should know, by the way, I'm homosexual." And he wrote back a really lovely letter saying, "Well, it doesn't matter. You're my son nonetheless, and we should have a proper relationship." He died of dementia last year, living in Alderney. And he had frontal lobe dementia, which is different from vascular and quite often leads to all sorts of difficult sort of behavioural stuff. And it was never a warm relationship. And in fact, oddly enough, we always finished letters to each other in Spanish. Un abrazo fuerte, a strong hug.
And this reality of living with your mother's alcoholism really does seem to have marked you in the book. It's very, very noticeable.
Yes, I mean, it means I'm not very, well, there's part of me that is very regretful about some of the things I said to Mum, and I wish I could have been a better son and I could have helped her more. There was one episode when I was absolutely furious. She'd managed to get into financial difficulties, so she lost the flat that she had after Mum and Dad split up, and then I bought a flat for her in Glasgow, and it meant that all she had to do was find food and stuff. And one weekend I went up and took her out and bought her a whole set of new clothes at Marks & Spencer's. I came back 3 weeks later and she'd taken all the clothes back to Marks & Spencer's and exchanged it for vodka. And I was so angry. I just cannot tell you how fury burnt within me. And I probably said, I said lots of things I shouldn't have said to her, and I wish, all of that could have been otherwise. But one of her friends said to me, a wonderful woman called Anna Tempest, she said to me, "You've got to remember, Chris, that you can't ever live somebody else's life." And it's true. And I often feel this as an MP, when I have people coming to see me in my surgery, because often they'll come with terrible, terrible, life stories and in a terrible place. And sometimes it's because they made one bad decision like 20 years ago, and it's led to a series of other unavoidably bad decisions. And I want to sort of change their life for them and live their life for them, and I can't.
And you wanted as a teenager to become an actor. Was that as an escape, or?
A bit, yes. I acted in the National Youth Theatre, and I did my first season when I was 15. I can still do my audition speech from Henry V. Now, entertain conjecture of a time when creeping murmur and the pouring dark fills the wide vessels of the universe. I toured with the National Youth Theatre and Richard II and Good Lads at Heart. We went around Europe. We opened the new Royal Theatre in The Hague and so on. And I love theatre. And part of that, I suppose, and also when I was at school, it was the only way I know this is ironic, being that I'm slightly homosexual these days, but back then, it was the only way to meet girls, because my school was all boys and down the road was an all-girls school, and you could get to act in lots of plays and meet lots of girls.
And it should have been a time of great happiness, but you've been quite frank in the book about the sexual abuse suffered at the hands of Michael Croft, the founder of the NYT.
Yes, so I tell several stories that relate to the abuse of power by sexual power. Michael Croft was a wonderful guy in many ways. He created the National Youth Theatre, which is a wonderful institution. And I remember the first time I saw him in action, he was introducing the new season and saying, and all the kids were there in Haverstock Hill School, and he said, "You've got to keep your wits about you." After all, the first time I was in London, I was walking across Hampstead Heath, and a man came up to me and said, "Would you like to see Big Ben?" And before I could say yes or no, he'd put it in my hand. Now, nobody would do that today, running a youth organisation or a school. Nobody would tell that story. So part of this is a story about how things have dramatically changed over the years. But Michael, he certainly groomed me. There was only one occasion when he forced me, required me to have sex with him. I know subsequently to my telling this story, because quite a few other people have been in touch, that many other people had a much, much worse experience of Michael's sexual grooming and abuse. And I know that it wouldn't happen in today's National Youth Theatre, which is very, has very strong safeguarding protections and so on. And then, ironically enough, I did Michael's funeral because he died the week before I was ordained as a deacon, and so I was able to perform his funeral. And I don't, well, I refuse to be a victim. And secondly, I don't feel that it destroyed me, but I know that other people had a much worse experience. But then when I went to Oxford, when I applied to Oxford, I went to St. Cat's College. I applied to St. Catherine's College, Oxford. And as part of my exam process, in the evening, I was required to come back to the tutor's room, Michael Guerintosh's room, having done an essay on Shelley's poem Mont Blanc, sit on the toilet whilst he soaped himself naked in the bath and read out my essay. And then he asked me, "Do you like women, Christopher?" And I went, "I'm very fond of my mother," which is like completely the wrong answer. But I think, so part of what I'm trying to do in telling all of this story is to show that a lot of this happened in completely inappropriate ways, and thank God the world has changed. But also, I'm conscious, since I've told this story, that some people have just been utterly vile to me.
How does that feel or even make sense? I mean, you'd expect that sharing that kind of experience would invite support at the very least. Or
and I'm not inviting support. I try to tell the story as straightforwardly as I can, and I say that I didn't feel destroyed by it. But people have said to me, the vast majority of people, of course, have been lovely. But just some people on social media, of course, normally from an anonymous account, but sometimes emails and so on as well, have said, "You're lying, you asked for it, you led him on." I mean, all this kind of stuff. And anyway, you're only doing this to sell a book. And you go, honestly, that is why so many women never, ever report a rape.
I think that there can also be, people who've been victims of abuse themselves, kind of lashing out at others, other people who have come to terms with what happened to them. I think those people can find it hard to see that. I can remember I read something like this in the context of, religious abuse in the US, of actually people lashing out were the ones who'd actually been victims themselves, but were, confronted with people saying, "This is what happened to me, it was not okay," etc., just instinctively going, "Ugh." And yeah, so I don't know, but...
Well, maybe there's some of that, but it actually, I mean, I've had, as I said, maybe 6 or 7 people now who were in the National Youth Theatre and had much more sustained abuse from Michael get in touch with me and say thank you. And I've chatted it through with a couple of them as well. So I think, and for some of them, they had already made their, they'd already told their story to the National Youth Theatre a few years ago. The National Youth Theatre apologised and given them all the support they needed. But they'd never had a moment when it had become public, and that they could therefore know that somebody else, it wasn't just them. Because if you think it is only you, then you kind of think, well, maybe it was my fault.
When did you realise that you wanted to be a priest?
I went to Oxford, as I say, a proper little Tory. All the people who'd supported me through my mum's alcoholism, including my English teacher, Tim Pearce, and in my last year at school, I lived with the school chaplain and his wife, Sam and Margaret Salter. And also my grandmother had 3 sisters who never married, spinster sisters, who actually went to St. Trinian School, the real St. Trinian School. All of those people who were supportive of me were Christian. They believed in the church, and they hoped that I would have a faith. And when I arrived at Oxford the first Sunday, I went to church. And I kept on going to church all through my time at Oxford. I had a kind of moment when we were touring in the National Youth Theatre. It's not, like there was a big finger pointing out of the heavens at me, and I didn't hear voices or anything, but I just kind of felt I should do something serious with my life. And that moment, that for me meant ordination. And the best part of a decade, I suppose, if you include my training, my preparation for training, my going to Latin America as part of that training, the theological college, and then being a curate in High Wycombe, and then youth chaplain in the Diocese of Peterborough. It was a decade of my life, and I wouldn't change any of that. It's a phenomenal privilege as a priest. Well, I was a deacon, in fact. You were ordained deacon first and then a priest. But I remember only like days after I was ordained going to take communion to an elderly lady who was bedridden, and I knocked on the door, went in, gave her communion, and she died holding my hand. And that's such a phenomenal privilege to be there when and I think I've been told that this is the thing that happens, that sometimes people will let themselves go when there's another person in the room. And I think that's what happened with her.
So obviously you decided to kind of change careers after a while. We'll talk about it in a moment. But do you think you were good at it? Like, do you think you were good at kind of being a deacon, being a priest? Is it something that came easily to you, or did you have to work on it?
I'm always very reluctant to say I was any good at anything. Seems a bit like blowing my own
Did you
trumpet.
ever feel comfortable?
Though this is
I
a fundamentally narcissistic thing, isn't it? Writing an autobiography.
Shall we say comfortable? I guess, did you ever ease
I loved
into...
doing it. I mean, there was some very funny moments. One Palm Sunday, we'd gathered, all the other churches were joining us, and we were going to process down from the parish room down into the church behind a donkey, singing Hosanna and all that kind of stuff. But hundreds had turned up this one year, and we used radio mics in the church then. So we started off in the parish room about 200 yards up the road, and we'd already sung all 8 verses of Hail Thee Festival Day, or whatever it is, about 6 times before we left the church hall. And the vicar turned to me. This is the polite version of what he said. And he said, "How long is this blasted procession going to go on?" And this was transmitted down to the church, where the old ladies who didn't feel up to the sort of walking bit went, "Oh, the Lord has spoken." So sometimes it was just very funny as well. But I mean, I think I was good as a youth worker. There are moments that I'm phenomenally proud of where I think I definitely helped some young people that are having a really tough time.
And so do you think there's anything from those years that you've kind of kept with you going forward and that have made you, I would say, that actually either a better politician or a worse one, because they're probably quite different jobs?
Well, one bit that is identical is that a parish priest is remarkably similar to a constituency MP. And that's one of the bits that I love about being an MP in our system, unlike lots of others in the world where, you don't really have a constituency. And, if I go into Morrison's in Porth, people will come up and chat to me about what's going on around the corner and what I think of the new development in Tonopandi or whatever. And that's very similar to being a priest in the Church of England. You have a relationship with a flock.
And how about Parliament? Because I feel like, over the past few years especially, we've had so many stories on the politics of the Church of England. So did that prepare you in any way for the kind of the politics of politics?
Oh, there is far more vituperative politics in a parochial church council than there is even in a local Labour Party meeting.
That's a high bar.
It's a pretty high bar, but honestly, because you would have a row about what vestments to wear. And interestingly enough, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church on the eve of the Russian Revolution in 1917 was debating whether to wear black or purple vestments for a funeral. And that sort of thing happened all the time in the church. And when I was at theological college, it was the first year that they had more than one woman. So you couldn't just treat women as honorary chaps. And that led to a terrible kind of conflict within the college. And weirdly enough, a lot of the gay trainee clergy were the worst. I mean, they were passionately opposed to the ordination of women. They thought having women in the college was despicable. I tell the story of dismantling the Deanery of Nuns, which was basically a toilet dressed up with lots of kitsch church paraphernalia, and how that got us, the few of us who did that in the college, completely ostracised.
You quit in 1991 after 4 years as a priest because you thought that being gay and being a priest were actually incompatible. Is this something you still think, you still believe in?
So it's not quite right to say that. I mean, I had kind of I worked out because my girlfriend woke me up one morning and said, Christopher, you know you're gay, but I probably wasn't meant to be sleeping with anyone, was it? Because I was a priest in the Church of England and I wasn't married to her. But nonetheless, Donna woke me up and said, by the way, you do know you're gay, don't you? And that's when I kind of settled into it rather than anything else. And my anxiety was, at the time, previous to then, the church's line has been don't ask, don't tell. And there were loads of parishes that had gay clergy, especially in the inner cities, because clergy with kids wanted them to go to good schools. So that they would choose parishes that on that basis. And then the church changed to a position of, yes, we want to know everything about everybody. Oh, and by the way, we think homosexuality is the sin that can't be erased. And that's when I worked out that there was a whole bunch of clergy that I would meet who were leading double lives. They'd go off to Sitges and Mykonos on holiday. They would, leave their dog collar behind. They'd desperately hope that there wouldn't be anybody from the Sun or the News of the World on holiday at the same time, because that would be a revelation that could get them sacked. But back at home, the only way they would ever be able to have any kind of sexual life would be cottaging and so on, because they wouldn't ever be able to have a partner. The partner would be the bit that proved that they were breaching canon law and they'd be out on their ear. And I didn't want to be that kind of person that got to the age of 60, hating the church for the way it had refused to let me live my full life. And I thought, look, it's better just to go. It actually felt a bit like when I recused myself over Boris Johnson, because I kind of felt, okay, I don't have to go, but I kind of feel I ought to. It's the right thing to do.
So you were once chairman of the Christian Socialist movement. And what do you make, and this is a slightly broader question, but what do you make of Christianity having, for lack of a better term, kind of become quite conservative coded in kind of politics globally over the past few years? Well, I guess since Trump, probably, there's something about the kind of, the new Catholics or the kind of weird trans cath, etc. There's a kind of sense of the reactionary movement being underpinned by the evangelicals, etc. How does the religious left kind of fight back in this context?
Well, I'm available for Archbishop of Canterbury, and I'm more qualified than most people in the country. And I note that there's a vacancy. I think in many ways the Anglican Church, which is the one obviously that I know best, is just a little bit lost. I mean, partly because it has obviously a basis in established law in it here, but it's pulled by its cousins in Africa and in the United States of America and Australia and so on in different directions. It can't decide whether it really still believes in the 39 articles of religion or only some of them. And that's very tough for it. I mean, I've never been a fundamentalist in my religion, or for that matter in my politics. In fact, I despise fundamentalism. I think it's an abdication of what I would describe as our God-given powers of rationality. So maybe one day I will write a book called Bad Faith, Good Faith, because the abuse of faith in political circles, I think, is one of the most dangerous things in modern society.
What was it like being selected for the safe Labour seat of Rhondda?
It was interesting for lots of different reasons because, I mean, I'd been very much... I'd stood in High Wycombe in 1997 in the general election then and came a creditable second. And very nicely, the election agent for the Tories from that election got in touch with me a couple of days ago to say, apparently on the night, he had tried to get a ballot paper which said that Ray Whitney, the Tory candidate, is an anchor, let's put it that way, that was a vote for him. And apparently I'd said to him, oh, come off it. You're already going to win. You really don't need that additional vote. Anyway, he was being very nice. But that was where I'd been the curate in the parish church, so that felt natural. I then had my 2 years as head of European affairs for the BBC, which I loved, and I went for the Rhondda, where all the assumptions were that you would choose, a working class man who had worked in the mines maybe or in some kind of manual labour and was chapel, not church, and was married and not gay and certainly would never, ever have been a Tory. So I was like a very strange thing to get selected. It's very difficult, lots of gay people have to come out time and time and time again. It's only if you're like H from Steps, who is from the Ronda, incidentally, that you get the front page of the Sun and everybody knows all in one. So if you're trying to be the Labour candidate in a seat like the Ronda, which has been Labour since 1885 when miners got the vote, you don't think, hello, Mrs. Jones, it's very nice to meet you. Oh, by the way, I'm a raging puff. You just don't think that that's what you put in the conversation, but you sort of don't want it to be hidden. And it was quite nice that I rang one woman and said, hello, I'm Chris Bryant. She said, oh, I know who you are. And I said, oh, right, well, you probably know why I'm ringing. She said, yes, I do. And somebody's rung about you, in fact. And she said, just answer me one thing, though. Are you gay? And tell me the truth. And I said, yes, I am. I live with my partner, and I want to be the Labour. She said, you don't have to go on. It's all right. I'm gay as well. I've never told my husband, but my girlfriend knows. And what, of course, this did was, I mean, we all have stereotypes, don't we? We have stereotypes about what the valleys will be like. We have in South Wales. We have stereotypes about what the gays are like, and some of which are true, and so on. And every single time they wrote about my standing in the Ronda in 2001, they said, gay, gay, gay. I mean, it was always in the headline. Whatever the story was about, it was gay. And even on election night, once I'd won, the BBC described me as exotic, too exotic for the Ronda. And what they meant was too gay.
Huh. Exotic's a weird one as well, because you'd see that normally, I feel like, as a racist dog whistle. Like, exotic's a bit like, ooh, a bit brown. But I felt, again, I'd not thought of it that
pink.
way, but that's, yeah.
How pink was my valley? That was a headline in one newspaper.
I mean, that's slightly funny. I don't want to give it to them, but then it's slightly funny.
No,
it's
quite funny.
To be homophobic,
No, but it's also like when Elton John got married, the front page of the Sun was Elton takes David up the aisle.
Nice.
Now, I was furious at first, and then I thought, no, it's just funny. It's just funny. So, but also, incidentally, the Daily Mail has often referred to me as an ex-gay priest. Now, the gay thing is coming along quite nicely. In fact, I'm a practicing homosexual, but the priest thing, not so much.
So the on a weirdly unrelated note, the blurb of the book is very keen to stress your time in sweaty gay clubs. I quote. What kind of dancer were you? Like, what were your favourite songs on the dance floor back in the day?
Well, the day I stopped being I preached my last sermon. Apart from the preachy things I do sometimes in Parliament. But the last time I preached was at Peterborough Cathedral on Maundy Thursday, or Good Friday, actually, I think, in 1992, sorry. I drove down to London. All my furniture had already moved. It was stacked up in my flat, and I decided, right, I'm going for a drink. I put on my tight white T-shirt and my 501s, mandatory outfit for a gay man in those days, and went to the London Apprentice, a fabulous bar which no longer exists. Walked up to the bar, ordered a pint. Pint was poured, and then I realised I didn't have my wallet. And there was a man standing next to me, short man, ginger, not much hair on his head. And he said, it's all right, I'll pay. And you don't even have to have sex with me. And it was Jimmy Somerville. I loved dancing to everything by him. Every time I went into a bar, it felt to me as if It's a Sin by the Pet Shop Boys was playing. Which felt, Father, forgive me. It was like, all right, you don't have to play it specifically for me. I used to like going to Molly Moggs, which was a drag bar on the corner of Old Compton Street and Charing Cross Road. And because Julie Pade, who was the drag act there, used to sing all sorts of different songs. Some kind of music hall numbers and My Old Man Said Follow the Van and all that kind of stuff, and a bit of Edith Piaf and so on. And sometimes we'd just go out onto the street with the mic and get on the bus and perform to the people on the bus, and then get off the bus in our high heels and storm back. So I used to love a bit of that.
Do you have, this is more really of a personal question because I'm really curious, why do you think, because Westminster, to listeners who may not know this, people in Westminster are kind of obsessed with karaoke, like it's a massive thing in the bubble. Why do you think people prefer singing to dancing in politics?
I don't know.
I didn't know either. It's not, yeah.
One of my never go karaokeing with Ed Balls, by the way. because he will just come in and switch all of your songs off and put his own ones on. It's just absolute. There should be karaoke etiquette. I was a character recently in a play at the Lincoln Centre called Corruption, which is based on Tom Watson's book about Dial M for Murdoch. And apparently my character comes on singing Big Spender in a karaoke bar. This is based on a true experience. I have quite often done my Shirley Bassey impersonation. But what irritates me is there is never Je ne regrette rien. It's never available. They have other bastardized versions, but never the proper thing. So you can't sing it, which I'm sure we could both do.
Are you inviting, even as a trio,
you do not want me to sing that.
Je me fous du passé, avec mes souvenirs. C'est allumer le feu.
I've never hit
mes
a note
besoins,
in my
mes
life.
plaisirs. Je n'ai plus besoin de.
That is impressive. I don't actually know the lyrics, I think.
Me neither. But
I know that I went to the first night of Les Mis at the Barbican, which I think was October the 2nd, 1985. And I know all of it in English and in French. À la volonté du peuple et à la santé du progrès.
Chris, as chair of the Standards and Privileges Committee from 2020 to 2023, you dealt with a golden age of dodginess and outright corruption. Owen Paterson's paid lobbying, which played a huge role in bringing down Boris Johnson, Scott Benton offering to leak confidential information and lobby ministers, Chris Pincher drunkenly groping two men in the Carlton Club, and Partygate. In fact, when I trotted up the figures on the last Parliament, I found 127 MPs had been censured or embroiled in some suggestion of wrongdoing. I imagine it was something that kept you quite busy.
Yes, when I became chair of the Standards and Privileges Committees, they're two different committees, ironically enough nowadays, I was told it'd be a quiet gig and I wouldn't have much to do. That was without reckoning with Boris Johnson. Though, I mean, I'm not, you're right in terms of timeline, that sort of the first thing that broke the Boris Johnson premiership was Owen Paterson, because they threw everything at changing the rules at the very last minute. Jacob Rees-Mogg behaving absolutely disgracefully and all the rest of it. Though in the end, I think it was Boris Johnson that did for Boris Johnson. It's like that song in Thrupney Opera, the Solomon song, which is about the tragic flaw in everyone, except that Boris Johnson is just one massive tragic flaw.
In the book, you talk about how you were worried that you were behaving like a self-righteous prig. Is that a big concern when overseeing parliamentary standards?
Yes, it is. And going back to my mum, I suppose I'm not very judgmental, or I certainly don't want to be judgmental about others. I mean, I can be as rude about somebody else's footwear as anybody else can, but I just... there but for the grace of God go I is a pretty good principle to adopt generally in politics. And in actual fact, whenever anybody gets into trouble, I couldn't do this when I was chair of the committee, but I do now. Whenever anybody gets into any kind of trouble, whether they're a complete and utter wrong or not, I do drop them a note and say that I hope they're okay, because the level of the quantity of ordure that you receive in public life just on a normal day is pretty bad, but when there's a big pile on it, can be really, really horrible.
And that sometimes, I think, surprises people outside of politics, that even when you have fundamental differences, and even if you think somebody's done something very, very wrong, you can still, on a human level, empathise with them and reach out to them.
Yeah, well, and likewise, one of my kind of heroines from British political and Christian past is Josephine Butler, because of all the work she did around visiting people in prison and prison reformers. Because in the end, we are all human beings. And in a sense, it's also why I wrote this book. I didn't instantly choose the title of A Life and a Half. That was the publishers, because they went, well, you haven't half lived it. Oh, there we are, A Life and a Half. But one of the reasons for me writing it is that sense that if you prick us, do we not bleed? Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. I think that's kind of quite important, that we understand that MPs are humans.
I don't imagine it's a very popular role, policing parliamentary standards. Did it fray some of your sort of personal friendships with other politicians?
No, actually it didn't.
They just hated you anyway.
Well, everybody loathes me. I mean, it's a well-known fact. I tried to be fair. I thought that the most important thing, but we didn't really have a very fair system, and we've made it fairer. And for that matter, for a very long time in Parliament, if somebody abused another person physically or bullied them, there was nowhere to go to complain. And now we do have a system, and I was fairly instrumental in making sure that happened. There were other people who played a very significant role, including Harriet Harman and Stella Creasy and people, but I played a role in that. And I wanted to make sure that the process was fair. Interestingly, the first case we had when I was chair was about Boris Johnson's holiday in Mustique.
Yeah.
And we found him innocent. We acquitted him because I just didn't think the evidence, we weighed the evidence, and that's the conclusion we came to.
How would you rate Boris Johnson as a politician and as a prime minister?
The thing is, I remember very clearly when I first met him, which of course was at Oxford, and I was in the gents. There are a few stories like this. I met Peter Mandelson first in the changing rooms at the YMCA, and that leads to some other stories. But anyway, Boris Johnson, I met him in the gents at the Oxford Union, and he came in perfectly attired, very tidy, his hair combed, and he went up to the mirror and zhuzhed his hair up so it was a mess. And from that moment, I've always thought he was a fraud, or it's all a pretense. It's just a pretense.
So you first stood for Parliament in '97 and actually lost one of the roughly sort of like 12 MPs, Labour candidates who failed to get a seat.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was at Wickham, so I feel like there were no great hopes.
Well, High Wycombe is now a Labour seat, of course. Emma Reynolds is the
true.
MP.
But actually, what did that feel like, given again like the kind of scale of the landslide? Like, did you kind of feel like the Dickensian orphan by the window, kind of for 4 years? Or
yes, a bit actually. but during that time, then I went to work for the BBC in Brussels and had a fabulous job. Weirdly, 2 weeks before the general election in 1997, the Observer rang me and said, "We're doing opinion polls in constituencies." I mean, this happens all the time now, but it was brand new back in 1997. And we're thinking we're going to do 100 seats, and number 100 would be either you or Enfield Southgate, which is where Michael Portillo is up against Stephen Twigg. Which do you think it should be? And I said, well, everybody knows who Michael Portillo is. Nobody knows who Sir Ray Whitney is. So I think you should go for Enfield Southgate, and which they did. And of course, that I think then helped lots of Lib Dems decide that they were going to lend their vote to Labour, which is how Stephen Twigg won and gave you the Portillo moment on election night. Whereas I was about 2,000 votes out.
And so the first motion you ever tabled as an MP once you did get elected was for, I quote, a wholly and substantially elected second chamber. Do you still stand by that? And how likely do you think that is to become reality?
Oh, well, those are two very different questions, aren't they?
They are.
Yes, no, the very first, you're right, the first early day motion that Fiona McTaggart and I tabled together, I remember sitting in the tea room and drawing it up, was for a wholly or substantially elected second chamber. And I was the sort of unofficial chief whip for the people who wanted to move towards a reformed second chamber, and I'm still fully subscribed to that. I'm also a Remainer. I was a Remainer. I remain a Remainer, and I will remain a Remainer until my dying day. I think we will end up with a better system. I mean, the House of Lords is now preposterous, utterly preposterous, and the height of irony is. You then get Nigel Farage, who I thought was always opposed to unelected officials governing us, wanting to be allowed to appoint people to the House of Lords. It's already more than 800 people. It's absolutely preposterous, and of course it will have to change.
And so, as the book makes clear, you had quite the life before entering Parliament. You got up to quite a lot. You didn't really have the profile of the kind of actually, the people you see getting into Parliament now. So, what do you make of, I guess, the kind of increasing professionalisation of the political class in Britain? You see the people kind of born and bred in SW1 who were maybe like MP staff and then special advisor, and then so kind of who've never meaningfully left Westminster. Like, what do you make of the fact there are more and more of those, and probably fewer and fewer of you?
Well, you can have been a special advisor and brought up in the political class and still be a fascinating and brilliant individual. The case I would give you is Torsten Bell. He's hilarious, he's witty, he's entertaining.
Also not aging, as far as I can tell, which is really concerning.
No, I think he's got genes. He's got good genes, as has his twin brother. But he's won everybody over in his constituency. So I'm not as dismissive as some others would be. Actually, I think the intake this last time, and this is not a partisan point, it's not just about Labour MPs, but I'd say it's a very strong intake. There's a lot of very able people. And one of the things about our system is 650 MPs is a lot. And sometimes they are knocking around looking for something useful to do. So that's difficult. But I do want greater variety. But you could argue that I'm, classic old school, public school, Oxford, there's a lot of gingers in Parliament. But I think you also want people who are able to embrace their humanity.
And a couple of years ago, you wrote the book Code of Conduct, Why We Need to Fix Parliament and How to Do It. And you laid out a whole sort of prescription for what needs to be done. How do you think we're doing on that?
Is that an official statement, Minister?
Yes. No, it's not. I'm not here as a minister. I think that, actually quite a lot of the things that I put in the book, I've not got this list in my head, but we have now done in the first year. So, for instance, I said that I think we should tighten up the rules about consultancies and directorships and things like that. We've already done that. We also said that government ministers should publish all their hospitality and the amount of it, which previous ministers had always had written an exemption into the rules for themselves for, and we're doing that, and we've got it in the neck. For doing so, but I think it's the right thing. Greater transparency is always a good thing. There are more reforms I'd like to see, but I'm part of a team, so I have to play as a team player.
And we're still getting undeclared bespoke suits for the Prime Minister donated by a Labour peer.
What now?
Well, we have done it in the last year.
Oh, yes. But interestingly, I don't think in the past that would have even been declared. And so I think it's important that all of that stuff is completely transparent. That's the point I'm making. There was this hilarious case when I was chair of the committee where I think Priti Patel had gone to a Bond premiere, but because she'd decided that she'd gone as Home Secretary and not as an MP, just as an ordinary MP, she didn't have to declare it. And I remember asking Michael Ellis, the Tory MP, why, and he said, "Well, I think you'll find that James Bond exercises executive functions." You go, what? And anyway, she was Home Secretary, and Bond is a fictional character, to go back to Galina from Russia, like Anna Karenina, and also was in MI6, not MI5. So not relevant to the Home Office. So look, I just want transparency. And then once you've got transparency, then we've all got to be a bit kind of grown up about it.
Politics is a messy business and life is a messy business involving compromises and regrets. I wanted to finish by asking, what are your biggest regrets before and since entering politics?
No.
No, we want an actual reply on this.
Give us one regret, Chris. Or you'll regret it. We're not going to blackmail you.
No, I do actually regret a lot of things. And part of that word that I referred to earlier, ojalá, is about has an element of regret in it. I wish I'd sorted out my relationship with my dad earlier. I wish I'd been kinder to my mother when she was just ill with alcoholism. It's a disease rather than anything else. I think when I arrived in Parliament in 2001, I jumped at every single media opportunity. I thought that was what it was all about, and I regret that. I wish I had been much, much more vocal in the shadow cabinet when we effectively let the Brexit referendum foot run away from us. So I've got quite a few regrets. But my biggest is that Edith Piaf's Je ne regrette rien is never available in karaoke bars, even when Ed Balls is there.
While we're talking about creative works, it's the end of the show, and that means it's time for escape routes. Which books, movies, music, TV, and other cultural pursuits have we been using as psychological refuges from politics lately? Chris?
Well, I'm the arts minister, so I have a lot of escapes. But I'm just back from the Edinburgh Festival, and I saw the BBC Symphony Orchestra do the Chichester Psalms with Hugh Cutting singing the countertenor role. It is such a sublime piece of music. So classical music for me, nearly always. Bit of Bach, bit of Handel. I'm delighted that the Royal Opera House later on this year is doing my second favourite opera, which is Ariodante, because I love the aria Scherzo in Fida.
Anne-Marie? How about you?
Well, it feels slightly unfair because I was on the last Oh God, What Now? But, I feel like I recommended a book last time and I'm going to recommend a book again. So last time was Out of Sheer Age by Jeff Dyer, which is incredibly funny. And I'm going to do a 180 here and talk about The Door by Magda Szabo, which is absolutely phenomenal. So it's a book by this Hungarian author. Again, long-term listeners will know that I'm a freak for Hungarian literature. But she's absolutely brilliant in this. I don't even want to really spoil anything, but beautiful, beautiful novel on essentially the relationship between this kind of woman we'd never really find out, probably in her 30s, 40s, and essentially just her housekeeper, but who's this absolutely remarkable woman in kind of 20th century Budapest. And yeah, again, I don't want to say more than that, but it's, I think, genuinely shaping up to be, I've not quite finished it, but one of the best books I've ever read. Like, the prose is remarkable and the story is amazing. And yeah, read The Door by Magda Szabo.
Have you read Caris Davis's Clear? It's a short novel. It's absolutely beautiful. It's set in the Highland clearances, and it's about a man being sent by the Duke of wherever to go and clear the last person from a tiny island. It's a very beautiful novel.
And Seth, what about yours?
I've been binging on Doctor Who, and I've gone from really, really good early Tom Baker to late Tom Baker, which is awful. Awful. It's indulgent. It's what happens when you have a boozy actor who's out of control that no one can say no to, who can't be bothered to remember the script and will just wing it the whole time through.
There's a great moment when Doctor Who was played by Tom Baker, when his assistant is Perry, and there's a baddie who has to be doused in water all the time. And he actually says the line, he needs more water. Oh, Perry, eh?
Writes programme wrong Baker. It's Colin Baker.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry to geek out. And that's the end of the show. Thank you to our guest, Chris Bryant.
Thanks very much for having me.
And listeners can order A Life and a Half, The Unexpected Making of a Politician, from our own bookshop. There's a link in the show notes, and you'll be helping both Chris and Oh God, What Now? So it's a win-win. Thanks for joining us, Marie Le Conte.
Thanks for having me.
And listeners, we hope you're enjoying our new deep dives at the start of the week. We're covering day-to-day politics on the Friday edition, so don't forget to subscribe. And if you back us on Patreon, you'll get Friday's show on Thursday, as well as the irreplaceable warm feeling of supporting independent podcasting. Follow the link in the show notes to find out how. Don't forget, if you've got questions for the pod about anything at all, send them to info@romaniacs.com. You might make but your emails. And if you do have a moment to give us a 5-star review on your favourite app, then please do so. It really helps. Thanks for listening. We'll see you at the end of the week.